the semester talking about the death penalty in the United States. But now let's talk about the federal death penalty, military death penalty, and some other countries and how they carry out the death penalty. So, only 30% of the world's countries have the death penalty, and the US is the only Western democracy with it. And you can look at this map here and you can see which countries retain the death penalty and which don't. So in 2008, Mexican national Jose Medellin was executed in Texas for the 1993 gang rape and murder of 14-year-old Jennifer Ertman and 16-year-old Elizabeth Pena as part of a gang initiation. Now, the Mexican government sued the U.S. and the International Court of Justice on behalf of 51 other Mexican nationals that were on death row, arguing that the U.S. was violating international law. Texas said Mexico has no standing to bring the case and went ahead and carried out the execution. So one thing we want to remember is that the United States is a federation of states and that we value local autonomy and limited government. So while each state is part of the United States, in this particular case, it wasn't U.S. policy to carry out the death penalty. It was Texas policy. So unless the Supreme Court rules the death penalty to be unconstitutional, each state has the right to decide whether to keep or abolish the death penalty. So Mexico was essentially suing the U.S., but the U.S. was essentially not able to do anything about it. So the federal government has a death penalty for a wider array of circumstances than any state does, but federal executions are pretty rare. So as of February, there were 62 inmates on federal death row, 61 men and 1 woman. Men are held in Terre Haute, Indiana, and women in Fort Worth, Texas. Since the reinstatement of the federal death penalty in 1988, 78 defendants have been sentenced to death. 3 were executed and 12 have been removed from death row. Now, the federal government suspended the death penalty in 1972, just like the states did with the Furman case, but it didn't take any steps to reinstate it until the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988. The first execution since then was that of Timothy McVeigh in 2001. A week later, drug kingpin Juan Raul Garza was executed for drug-related killings. Louis Jones Jr. for the 2003 kidnapping, rape, and murder of a woman on a U.S. Air Force base, and most recently, Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was sentenced to death. So the Federal Death Penalty Act of 1994 established constitutional procedures to impose the death penalty, and it's for 60 different offenses under 13 existing and 28 new federal capital statutes. So generally speaking, again, in order to get the death penalty, you need to commit a homicide. Espionage and treason are also included in this, as are some non-homicidal narcotics offenses, but no prosecutor has sought the death penalty for this. And I think if they did, that the Supreme Court would rule that to be unconstitutional. Now, the federal legislative and executive branches have played a very limited role in state criminal matters. So after the non-guilty verdict for the police officers in the Rodney King beating, the case was tried under federal civil rights violations. 2 officers were found guilty and imprisoned, and 2 were acquitted. So we have dual sovereignty. We have dual citizenship. We have citizenship within the state that we live in and within the United States. That does mean we can be tried at both the federal and the state level without it being a violation of double jeopardy. Usually when the federal government steps in to prosecute a case, the state is happy about that. And it often is used as a way to seek the death penalty in a state that doesn't have the death penalty. So Ronnell Wilson was the leader of a violent drug gang, the Stapleton Crew, and he executed 2 undercover police officers in New York in 2003. The DA met with the federal prosecutor because New York didn't have the death penalty, and he was charged federally with 2 counts of murder and furtherance of racketeering and was sentenced to death. Gary Lee Sampson was convicted of 2 counts of carjacking in 2001 for a crime that occurred in Massachusetts, but was tried by the feds as part of a special anti-carjacking statute. Now, the federal government can also use the Commerce Clause of the Constitution to try a case federally. So the Constitution gives the states powers to regulate commerce. So if you use anything that is considered part of commerce, then your case could be tried federally. So in 2008, Michael Jacks kidnapped, raped, and murdered his 12-year-old niece, Brooke Bennett, in Vermont. He enlisted the help of another girl he was molesting, and he did so via email and text. Since email and the car driven by jocks are instruments of interstate commerce, he was tried federally, and he pled guilty and was sentenced to life without parole. Now, the military has its own code of justice, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and it has its own death penalty. And the UCMJ sets standards of procedural and substantive criminal law. You have most of the same rights that you do if you were tried civilly, criminally, but not within the military. And executions in the military are even more rare than they are in federal civilian system. So the UCMJ lists 14 capital offenses. The bottom 4 can only be used during war. So desertion, assaulting or willfully disobeying a superior commissioned officer, lurking as a spy or acting as a spy, and misbehavior of a sentinel or lookout. Those are only applied during wartime. These other ones, as you can see, mutiny, misbehavior before the enemy, aiding the enemy, espionage, murder, rape, improper handling of a vessel. So the UCMJ is introduced in the mid-50s, and prior to this, the military justice was contained in the Articles of War. Now, at least 267 people were executed by the Union during the Civil War, and 169 were executed between 1942 and 1961. There have been no military executions since the execution of John Bennett, who was hanged at Leavenworth in 1961 for rape and attempted murder of an 11-year-old Austrian girl. And the U.S. military suspended the death penalty from 72 to 76, just like the states and the federal government. In 1983, the military death penalty was struck down as unconstitutional. Okay, so there's 5 civilian judges that are appointed for 15-year terms by the president with advice and consent of the Senate. Now, they exercise final appellate jurisdiction over members of the armed forces and other persons that are subject to the United States, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The procedures at the time didn't satisfy requirements that the court members must make specific findings of individualized aggravating circumstances. So the Reagan administration fixed this by listing 11 aggravating factors. Now, when military personnel are accused of committing a crime or some other infraction, they are subject to court-martial. We have 3 different types of court-martial. Summary court-martial does not require a judge and results in minor penalties. Special court-martial mirrors a civilian criminal trial and carries more penalties. And a general court-martial is the most serious offenses. These cases are heard by a panel of 12 members who decide the facts and the verdict. And they're usually commissioned officers from a different unit and of a higher rank than the person being tried. They're selected by the convening authority, which could be the president or an immediate superior. And if found guilty, the presiding military judge may impose the appropriate sentence according to UCMJ guidelines. In order to sentence someone to death, it needs to be a unanimous decision. So, currently on death row, we have, in the military, we have Ronald Gray, Hassan Akbar, who was accused of murdering some people in Kuwait, Timothy Hennis, and Nidal Hassan. Nidal Hassan was responsible for the terrorist attack at Fort Hood, Texas. Now, what about internationally speaking? Only a few countries retain the death penalty. In 2013, it was used most liberally in China, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and North Korea. It's usually applied swiftly, efficiently, and very cruelly, and with little concern for evidence or trials. And so here we kind of have a breakdown of executions and the various countries. So let's look at the communist world in China. So China is the leader of executions in 2017, and it is an authoritarian communist state governed by a single political party. So it operates under socialist law, which has a low-tolerance crime control model. Each person is theoretically the state, so there is no concept of individual rights and procedural protections. And China did not operate with any presumption of innocence until relatively recently. But they still really stress quote-unquote voluntary confession. contrition, and reintegration back into the community, but they still use torture sometimes to obtain confessions. The Chinese have lower crime rates and few chronic offenders relative to Western societies, and some think this is due to their frequent use of the death penalty, which can be applied for 55 different offenses. The actual number of executions is a state secret. Now, this very large and embarrassing number led to a government policy called kill fewer, kill carefully. The Chinese Supreme People's Court has a right to review each death sentence imposed by the lower court. As of July 2016, all appeals will be heard in open court. And in 2008, they overturned 15% of cases in the first 6 months of the year. And in 2007, they handed down 30% fewer deaths from the year before. Death sentences from the year before. Now, China has two types of death sentences, immediate and delayed. Delayed is a 2-year suspension of sentence, and this is for murder and certain kinds of rape or robbery. Murder and certain kinds of rape or robbery are not eligible for delayed sentences. So over that 2-year period, you need to show that you are reformed. If you are considered rehabilitated, then your sentence is commuted to a long period of incarceration. If not, you are executed. Immediate executions are carried out within 7 days of a field review of the penalty, and this is imposed when the offender is considered beyond rehabilitation. It's traditionally carried out by a single shot at the base of the skull or lethal injection. In cases of lethal injection, they use the same 3-drug cocktail that we use here in the United States. Now, they claim they made the switch to lethal injection for humanitarian concerns, but China has a very profitable organs for transplant industry, and about 65% of those organs come from executed prisoners. So China has specially equipped death vans that they shuttle from town to town, and this saves money for poorer localities. Corpses are then driven to a crematorium and burned before relatives or independent witnesses can view them. Now, let's look at North Korea. North Korea has been ruled by a single family since it was divided into North and South Korea in 1946. Now, countries are given a democracy score on a scale of 1 to 10 based on 63 different factors, such as public political participation and respect for civil rights. And you can look here and see that North Korea has a 1.08 democracy score. Practically every piece of information out of North Korea is government propaganda. So the media reports 95 executions in 2013, but South Korea tells us that North Korea conducts many public executions. According to a South Korea paper, at least 80 people were executed simultaneously in 7 cities in November 2013 for offenses such as watching South Korean movies, possessing a Bible, sexual misconduct, and distributing pornography. So there is no independent judiciary here, and that means the government can execute people without trials and appeals. Appeals can be heard, though, for non-capital cases. Many acts that warrant the death penalty are considered dangerous political acts, like passing out Bibles. And only prisoners suspected of non-capital crimes are permitted defense attorneys. So in North Korea, any crime can potentially be a capital crime if the government deems it such. Now let's look at the Islamic world. There are 3 factors that distinguish Islamic law from common law. One is that it is based on direct revelation from God, and as such it is unchangeable and binding on all people, whether you are a Muslim or not. Attempts to regulate behavior and thought processes of the individual on practically all matters. So there's rules for hygiene, diet, child rearing. And it neither requires nor finds it desirable to achieve uniformity of law. So let's look at Saudi Arabia. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is an oil-rich monarchy ruled by the House of Saud and has been an absolute monarchy since its founding in 1932. The Quran functions as Saudi Arabia's constitution and requires strict adherence. In 2013, they executed 79 people officially, but there are many secret executions as well. Now, there are 3 categories of crime which can carry the death penalty. And please excuse my pronunciation because this is not going to be right. Hudud, which is fixed punishments prescribed by the Quran, and include things like adultery, highway robbery, and apostasy, and those carry the death penalty. Now, the evidentiary requirements to prove this make it very difficult to get a conviction, and so this is the least likely to get the death penalty. Qisas or retribution crimes and tazir carry discretionary penalties. Only direct evidence is permitted, no circumstantial evidence. If you withdraw your confession and do so 4 times, the punishment cannot be applied. Now, whether a crime is categorized as qisas or hudud depends on the circumstances. So murder would be punished as hudud if committed during the commission of another hudud crime. Homosexual behavior and adultery can also be death-eligible offenses. So homosexuality is a capital crime for men, but carries a penalty of 100 lashes for females. Married adulterers can receive the death penalty, but unmarried partners receive 100 lashes. Now, executions and amputations are carried out in Riyadh, which is the capital, and Deira Square, which has been nicknamed Chop Shop Square by foreigners living there. Saudi Arabian judges usually have degrees in Sharia law, and sometimes they have a postgraduate qualification from the Institution of Higher Judiciary in Riyadh. But the legal education here is entirely religious, and neither blacks nor women can be judges. Death penalty cases are tried before a 3-judge panel known as the General Court, and the judges basically have unlimited discretion. They're not bound by precedent, but in murder cases, they are bound by the wishes of the victim's family, who can demand execution or forgive the defendant in exchange for blood money. Unless the sentence is handed down for a hudud or qisas crime, death penalty sentences are appealable, but appeals have to be filed within 30 days. Now, penalties for hudud crimes are prescribed by the Quran, and so they're not subject to interpretation, but the king can grant pardons and stays. Pardons are based on doubt of guilt, and the king cannot reduce the punishment for a hudud crime. The death penalty for a qisas crime can be appealed to a victim's family who may pardon the offender in exchange for blood money, but there's no possibility of pardon in general for these crimes. Now, tazir crimes carrying the death penalty are generally drug-related and terrorism, but can include things like sorcery, heresy, or spying for infidels. Now, Iran is also an Islamic nation, but follows Shia Islam, while the Saudis follow Sunni Islam. Prior to the Islamic Revolution, led by the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979, Iran was a secular, semi-democratic monarchy with civil law code, similar to what most European countries had at the time. Today, it's a theocratic, authoritarian state, and power is concentrated firmly in the Islamic clergy. At the top is the supreme leader, who is an Ayatollah, and then there's the Guardian Council, Assembly of Experts, the Expediency Council, and then the Office of the President. Criminal code in Iran is extremely harsh and is often subject to political and/or judicial whims. So a 16-year-old girl was publicly hanged for having unmarried sex. Now, Sharia law only mandates execution for married adulterers, so she was really punished for talking back to the judge. Islamic government sees rights as weaknesses and, quote, opposes the notion of human rights as a Western or Zionist evil. There's very little difference between how this is carried out in Iran and how it's carried out in Saudi Arabia. Iranians, however, are more likely to be executed by hanging than beheadings, and adulterers can be stoned to death. People who are convicted of robbery have the fingers of the right hand amputated prior to being publicly hanged. In qisas murders, again, members of the family are encouraged to carry out the execution. Now, the tazir category is the most important category for administering punishment from the state's point of view, because these are defined by the state and punishment is prescribed by the state. Now, this led to a death sentence for a 20-year-old student who threw 3 stones during a protest. The court argued that the rock is a weapon and throwing one is an act of war against God. Now, the new Iranian Penal Code indirectly encourages the murder of individuals belonging to certain disfavored groups by private Iranian citizens by exempting them from qisas. So the people who are exempt from this would be fathers and paternal grandfathers of the victim. If you've killed someone who has committed a hudud crime punishable by death, killing a rapist, killing a wife and her lover caught in the act of adultery, and Muslims who kill followers of unrecognized religions or non-protected persons. Most executions in Iran are for drug offenses, followed by murder, followed by rape. Now in Iraq has a constitution in 2005 that says it is a democratic, federal Islamic republic composed of executive, legislative, and judicial branches with political power residing with a president and a prime minister. Now, this is passed during the American occupation, so it's very Western. As Shiite Islamists have come to the forefront in government, they're looking to impose Sharia law on Iraqi society and eliminate that Western influence. In that 2005 constitution, we have women's rights regarding marriage, inheritance, and child custody. In 2014, the Iraqi cabinet voted in favor of Shiite Islamic jurisprudence in personal status affairs and permits the marriage of girls as young as 9, automatically awards child custody to fathers, and allows husbands to demand sex from their wives whenever they wish. In the ISIS-controlled areas, they've already reverted to Sharia law. So this was a war that we waged intending to bring democracy, and it's actually resulted in a more brutal Iraq than was under Hussein. Iraq led the world in the rate of executions in 2013, and right now it has serious violent sectarian conflicts between the Sunni and Shiite factions. There have been reports of executions for consensual homosexual activity. Theoretically, defendants facing the death penalty have access to lawyers, but they're pretty scarce. Few death penalty cases go to trial, and almost all convictions are the result of confessions obtained through torture or the threat of torture. Death sentences are appealed to the Court of Cassation, and both the President and the Prime Minister have the power to pardon. One appeal is allowed and must be heard within a month, but death sentences are enforced within 30 days of the final verdict.